Hi guys, it's Debbie, and today I would like to speak about The Godfather and its relative trilogy of films. This will be a mostly spoiler-free video, and although I will be speaking about all three films, I will be primarily focusing on the first film, as it is probably the one most people have seen, along with being the movie that sets up the whole story, introduces us to the characters, and the best one according to my own personal taste. For those who don't know me, although my accent might sound like I've just been having afternoon tea outside the Queen's Palace, in reality I am bilingual, English and Italian. I live in Italy, I've lived here basically all my life, so I thought it might be interesting to analyse these films from an Italian perspective, as they cover the story of the fictional Corleone family, Italian immigrants to the United States who created from nothing a net of organised crime, a very powerful mafia group. We have the leader, Don Vito Corleone, portrayed by Marlon Brando, his son Michael Corleone, Al Pacino, and all the brothers, sons, wives, girlfriends, associates, enemies in this sick business. Now, for a movie lover, I actually watched these films many years later than I should have, and I think I was mostly put off by them because, knowing hardly anything about the trilogy, I believed it was an over-stereotyped depiction of the Italian culture, of Italian abroad, as well as a glorification of the mafia. But I was wrong, and these are the reasons why. First of all, the mafia is not glorified in these films. It is shown in a very dynamic way, in a nearly epic manner, because of the intense and troubled history of the Corleone family, of how one word said 20 years earlier still has an effect, all the family ties, the consequences of relationships, life choices, but it is definitely not glorified. The mafia is a sick and twisted business. It unfortunately still affects Italy and many countries abroad today. Every scene in the films, every character on screen represents just how filthy it is. As a matter of fact, it is represented on the contrary as absurd. The films are a constant contrast of ridiculously over-the-top mansions, clothes, parties, food, and then murders, tortures, blackmailing, as if it were all totally normal. There is a famous scene called the Cannoli Scene, which looks like a comedic relief moment, as the characters are more interested in a box of cannoli rather than a murder scene. But in reality, it just highlights the absurdity of that world. If you're part of the mafia net, you have some form of protection. You have a somewhat safe income. That is why so many people, especially from poorer backgrounds, are attracted by this easy access to wealth. So the plot shows how the characters' problems are dealt with a click of the Don's fingers, of how nothing is unfeasible. But all of this comes with consequences. It's a spiraling tragedy. The characters end up doomed by a life of regret. They see loved ones taken away by the same net they created. They live in a constant cage. They live day by day. They may be enjoying sumptuous food with gold chains on their necks, but with blood on their hands within the walls of their compound, where even one window left open or one walk on the street may be fatal. These characters go to the extent of going into hiding for years, changing their realities, creating fake relationships, just to carry out one action for their family. So when we see Don Vito Corleone, his maidmen and associates apparently caring for the community, doing the best for their people, it sets up this idea of a compassionate and protective association. But it isn't. We would never glorify the actions of terrorists bombing down a building, even if in their mind they were doing it in the best interest for their community. So why would we do it for mafiosi? The way in which the Corleone family is introduced invites us to understand why certain decisions were made, find the justification for why they were made, because the characters build up this facade of it was the right thing to do. There was an interesting article by The New Yorker which spoke about how we never glorify the actions of criminals such as Charles Manson, but we tend to have these nearly romantic depictions of mobsters, mostly because they would seem to stand up to unpopular laws, care for their community, bring justice. Their immigrant background would make it a nearly epic story of building something from scratch, regardless of the hardships, and being judged as scum. They're depicted as living for the honour, for the family, for traditions, and the Godfather trilogy introduces us to these concepts. It depicts the characters as men who would die for the family honour. The films always open with sumptuous parties, plates of food, shiny shoes, and flashy suits, to then switch the camera around and show us the fraud that bought all this wealth. I think these ideas were conveyed in a superb manner thanks to the acting. The characters all have multifaceted personalities that were portrayed in an impeccable manner. Take Marlon Brando as Don Vito Corleone. He nearly appears like the old benevolent grandfather. He nearly looks reasonable. He refuses to organise certain activities such as selling drugs. And we nearly emphasise with him, we see his poor upbringing, the world he built and for which many feel grateful. But he is a cold-blooded murderer and criminal. He created that empire himself, he wanted it, and his greed doesn't seem to stop. His son, Michael Corleone, is also an incredible character. Al Pacino portrays him as a more relatable character, because he doesn't have this god-like position as his father, but still he doesn't hesitate when dealing with his business. He may have the charming smile, the nice attitude, but it's all a facade. Then all the maidmen and associates are portrayed as people who would die for their bosses, people who believe in the family, believe in what they're doing, who are grateful to their dons who saved them from a life of hardships, but who don't realise they are just disposable pawns in a machine that is way bigger than them. Probably one of the reasons why the acting included so many subtle nuances was that most of the cast was Italian or of Italian descent, meaning that they could understand and convey better some of the typical aspects of Italian society, especially the southern Italian society. The other reason I said earlier for which I hadn't seen these films for years was the fear of an over-stereotyped depiction of Italian society. And the films did portray the stereotypes, but in a good manner, in a manner that made sense for the films. For example, the idea of a tight family community of honour and respect of traditions is true, especially in the south of Italy. The characters are often seen focusing on things others wouldn't consider so important, such as sitting down together at a dinner table, being offended by small things such as the way one introduces himself, the female figure who is not brought into the business, a shake of the hand. These are all very small stereotype details, but which draw an accurate and realistic background. This is visible just a few minutes into a 10-hour-long trilogy when a baker who made a wedding for the Corleone family is shown off how big it will be, how the Corleone family will love it, and he does it by gesticulating, speaking loudly. Similar details happen over and over throughout the films. The mafia is a nearly unthinkable and unrealistic concept, but which is brought down to earth with these realistic situations. Vito Corleone's activity takes place in rooms while children are playing in the corridor outside. Decisions are made in small neighbourhoods around the dinner table. There is another moment in the trilogy which lasts about 20 seconds, but which shows the depth of the analysis of the characters in these films. It is a moment during the scene in which a huge figure in the mafia business is having a meeting, but is more interested in everybody taking a look at the food that had been brought, the birthday cake, before getting into business, showing in one simple scene 3 things. Number 1, the Italian tradition of having a big party, having the best food you could offer, trying to be nearly over the top, an Italian stereotype, but which is true. Number 2, how the mafia is so beyond rationality that multi-million criminal activities are organised over a club soda. Number 3, how the mafia is something real, which happens even in normal circumstances. It would not have been realistic if the characters had all been in white tank tops, gold watches, eating spaghetti on check tablecloths and slapping their wives, all unrealistic and exaggerated stereotypes. All of this emphasises the level of deception these figures achieve, of how they live their lives in a manner which has been perfected to not be caught. In a situation in which even just one word can give away everything, everything is timed, precise, meticulous. When speaking about stereotypes, another element which made me realise just how accurately planned these films were is that the typical Italian mannerisms are shown as gradually fading as we move from the older bosses who have lived in Italy or have been brought up following Italian tradition to the sons and grandsons who by then were Americans of Italian descent, as we can see in particular in the third film. And this is all tied with another element which brought more realism on screen, and that is the mix of American English and Sicilian dialects in the dialogues. If you've ever seen a film in which the characters are supposed to be foreigners, but you can tell they aren't, you know how the magical fades. But in the Godfather trilogy, the characters appear to the viewers as credible because they actually speak realistic levels of Italian. For example, in the scenes in Sicily, we have actual Sicilians who either only speak their dialect or who have a heavy accent when speaking in English. Then we have the older characters who have lived in Italy, such as Vito Corleone, and have spoken the language a lot and who know it very well. Then the sons and daughters such as Michael, Connie, who know the basics of Italian, they could have a basic conversation, but who still aren't that fluid. And then the last generation, who doesn't really know much more than grazie, prego, and the swear words. There are no characters pretending to be who they aren't. There are no characters forcing an accent. So again, this idea of mafia as something unthinkable and crazy is brought down to earth in a realistic situation. The overwhelming reality of the mafia is actually shown at its best when it confronts somebody who doesn't understand it, such as Kay Adams, Michael Corleone's American girlfriend, who is a total outsider to the world of the mafia and just doesn't understand it. Her mind can't grasp all of this reality, and she represents the outside world when it comes in contrast with this underworld. We often hear on the news of what the mafia has done, and it doesn't make any sense to us, but within those groups it does. And the character who is most on the edge between these two worlds is Michael Corleone, partly because of Kay, who is his voice of reason, partly because he didn't grow up in poverty as his father, partly because he was a US Marine for a while. He didn't enter the family business at a young age. So before he is actually carried away by this world, he is shown as more reflective, silent, cautious. I'm going to recommend some other works which elaborate on the topic of organised crime. For example, the novel Gomorra, written by Roberto Saviano and covering real-life moments regarding the Camorra, the Naples organised crime network. Due to his work, the writer's been living under police protection for over a decade, but his novel has then become a film and a TV series which became widely popular and which I would recommend for a modern insight into this underworld of criminality in Italy. I would also recommend Saviano's latest work, La Paranza dei Bambini, which covers the topic of children taken under the wing of organised crime because of the lack of other opportunities, especially in the impoverished areas in which they are brought up. There would be way more to say about the Godfather trilogy, but it would end up being a 10-hour long video, so I will leave it as it is. I would like to hear your opinions on the topic, so make sure to leave a comment down below. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, feel free to subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye.